So, as we approach the Old Testament here, and you're probably wondering, Pastor, Matt, we were going through Luke and things were going well. Why do this? As I was going through, I realized as I got to the end of the year, I only had 2 more real sermons, and I hadn't preached on the Old Testament all year, and that seems to be a grave oversight. For I was kind of known before as the guy who preached on the Old Testament maybe a little bit too much, and here I've just been going through the book of Luke. So I wanted to get to an Old Testament book, and Obadiah, as Audrey said, is the shortest. So as we've been doing Luke for 2 years, this is going to take 2 weeks. This week, we are going to look at the moral lesson of Obadiah, and next week, we are going to look at kind of the grand redemptive history story of Obadiah. Now, I like to get to the Old Testament because every word in the Bible we believe is true and applicable to our lives. And so we want to open it up and we want to see what God is teaching us in and through it. It shows us God's law, which I think is obvious. It shows us the story of God's people. But more importantly, I think again and again, as you read the Old Testament, you will see God's heart. And when you get to the New Testament, you won't be surprised when Jesus says things like love your enemies if you've been reading carefully in the Old Testament, because you will see God's heart here in all of these. And the Old Testament points us to Jesus Christ. Every word of the Old Testament is true and directly applicable to us as long as, and there's only one rule for reading the Old Testament, only one rule works for every single text, is that as long as you're reading it in light of the finished work of Jesus Christ, all of it is immediately applicable to us. And so we see it in the whole scope of God's story, and yet all of it is relevant. So, with all of that, let us go to Obadiah, except screen. All right, your brother Obadiah. Except first, we actually have to go to Kings. Now, Obadiah, you're probably wondering, what in the world is going on here? And so, I'm going to tell you what's going on. We know, hopefully, there was an ancient nation, Israel, the people of God who he was working with. Moses led them out of Egypt. They went, they founded a nation in Palestine. They had some judges, they had prophets, they had King Saul, King David, then Solomon. Then the nation split into Israel up top, Judah in the south. They continued on. There was a lot of bad kings in Israel, and pretty soon, under the Assyrians, God wiped them out, brought them into exile. Then many years later, the kings of Judah, despite being warned again and again to come back to the Lord, to worship him in heart, despite all of this, they turned away again and again. And in 2 Kings 25, in about the year 593 BC, and in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around, so the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. Now, everyone knows this is a very ominous time. And the army shows up, and they surround the city with troops. And then they build layers of fortifications to keep anyone from going in or out. See, 10 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar with his army had marched south through their country. And they did what they thought was a pretty prudent thing. They surrendered. They said, we will be subservient to, we'll pay you gold, just don't kill us all. Then 10 years later, Zedekiah, he decided, the Babylonians are a long ways off. I don't really feel like sending them this gold for nothing just so they won't, burn my city down. And so he rebelled. He didn't send the gold. So now the Babylonians march all the way back. And when they get there, do you think that they are going to cut a deal now with the people who just lied to them? No. There's not going to be any deals. This is a siege to the end. And so they surround the city. They put up their siege works. And for over a year, the people rely on whatever food they had gathered in. And then one day, the food runs out. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city, there was no food for the people of the land. Now, I don't know about you, but most of us probably had breakfast this morning. In my life, I have not gone more than like a single day, only a couple of times, without eating, and that was by choice. I had food in the cupboards. I couldn't imagine what it would be like staring at my family, knowing there was nothing more to feed them. Staring at my kids. The book of Lamentations give a picture. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives it to them. Very slowly, the infirm and the elderly begin to die. Then the children, and it's all the kind of stuff that people like us can barely even imagine. The Babylonians decide their target is now soft enough that they begin knocking down the front gate. And as this happens, Zedekiah, not the most courageous leader, decides he's going to make a run for it. Do you just imagine, by the way, like you're king of your people? At this point, like the Babylonians knocking down the wall, because of all the decisions you made, and now you decide to run? When Zedekiah, king of Judah, and all the soldiers saw them, the Babylonians, they fled, going out of the city at night by way of the king's garden, through the gate between the two walls, and they went towards the Arabah, as a desert. They went out, the Babylonians pursued, and they caught them. And the last thing Zedekiah would ever see on this earth was his sons getting executed before they put out his eyes. The army broke through the gate. Everything was burned, leveled, destroyed. Archaeologists still uncover a layer of ash underneath present-day Jerusalem, marking 592 BC, when everything was burned. The temple was taken down rock by rock. The walls were knocked down rock by rock until it was a level mound. The people suffered under, what happens in these ancient battles: murder, rape, destruction. And those who survived got taken into exile. Now, it's often overlooked in military conquests like this that the Babylonians, when they were laying siege to Jerusalem, they weren't running out of food because they had allies, or at least, people who weren't going to rebel against them because they didn't want that to happen to them. And so they are being brought food, and they had partners, and one of these people was the ancient brother, sometimes ally, sometimes enemy, Edom. The nation of Edom, lying just southeast of Jerusalem. in their high mountain fortresses. Edom was descended from their ancient ancestor Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, the father of all of the Israelites, descended from Abraham. They were related to each other. And yet, during the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, Edom, who would be a brother to Jacob, took full advantage of their relatives. When the army rushed into Jerusalem, they sat in their mountain fortresses and gloated. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. And this gets to what's going to be one of the big moral points of this, is that by their sitting back and doing nothing, they were complicit in the destruction of God's city. The warning: do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. And this word, it comes up a couple times here, gloat. And I hate gloating, but it's tempting to do when someone you dislike has something go poorly. You hate it when it happens to you. You're working, so you have this plan, you're working hard on something, and someone said, I think we should do something different. You're like, okay, I'm going to do it this way. And then after it fails, they're just sort of like, I told you so. It's like, I hate when people do that. That's just like the most annoying thing. I'm not going to mention anybody in my family here. Proverbs tells us, Proverbs 24:17, do not rejoice when your enemy falls. Do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and turn away his anger from him. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of their distress. There is this lesson here not to party when you see your enemy being destroyed. And I know that this is something in my heart, and I see it in kind of a trivial way, but it happens in more serious ways. And the trivial way is, when the Dallas Cowboys lose, I am almost as happy as when my football team wins. It's like I just enjoy seeing America's team get beat to a pulp. And why is that? There's this perverse part of me. But you apply it to people created in God's image, rejoicing in the day of their ruin, and something is very perverse there. The warning continued to Edom. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Now, it would seem from most evidence that the people doing the looting weren't the Edomites. This was mostly a Babylonian affair. They might have been serving as auxiliaries. But their standing by and giving aid to these people made them complicit in the crimes. And by their inaction to aid a brother, they were condemned along with the Babylonians who held the sword. And finally, maybe the worst thing they did, do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. Finally, above all these, after they gloated, when people were trying to escape, fleeing every which way, they stood at the crossroads, and they didn't lay a sword to anyone. Yet when the refugees came to their country line, they turned them back, or they held them until the Babylonians showed up to bring them into exile. Now, they are like, I'm not a pacifist. I do believe that a army that is working for a government can go to war. Like, I think that's okay. I don't think it's ever condemned in the Bible. But right here, like failing to give aid, even to an enemy, and they were enemies a lot of the time, failing to give aid to helpless refugees as they're fleeing destruction is condemned in the harshest of terms. When they're hungry and defenseless. And in fact, they are condemned here for their failure to love their enemies. Which is not surprising when Jesus has this same logic, Matthew 5:43. You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And it's such a natural human reaction to just want to pile on to people who oppose us, to kind of take pleasure in their ruin, and yet God tells us to love our enemies. And the deepest reason why is not just because like God wants to make up hard rules. The deepest reason why is that God's heart cares for those who even oppose him. God loves those who even, and we see this at the cross, who spit in his face, still says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if God's heart cares for those who oppose him, it is provoked and enraged when we might pile on to someone when they're down. Most of all, we see how God loves those who are opposed to him in the gospel. That while we were still enemies of God, Christ died for us, giving his life to save those who literally, in some cases, killed him. And so when Esau was standing high in his mountain dwelling, looking down on the destruction of Israel with their lofty and prideful glances, it provoked the heart of God that cares for the enemy. Now, this attitude, and I see this attitude so often nowadays in one situation that comes up again and again. And it's during COVID. So this happens, we get a prayer request, and so-and-so is in the hospital, they have COVID, and then there's the next question. What's the next question? Are they vaccinated? And that's the first question. And the reason why is that at that moment, maybe, I hope it's not in your heart, at that moment, the heart of somebody who's vaccinated and be like, maybe we wouldn't say this, but, well, people online say this. Maybe they deserved it. It's like, the fool didn't get vaccinated, and now they're going to die. And in that moment, we've looked down upon a brother, just like the Edomites on that day. And this is something we ought not to do, to condemn those who are made in God's image, to look down upon them for something as silly as a medical decision. And by the way, unvaccinated people, I will also not, I will not leave you guys out here, because on the other thing, you hear the news and be like, oh, they were vaccinated. Oh, well, now this, and we see everything just through the lens of a disagreement about a medical treatment, rather than having the compassion to all people that God has commanded us, even those who might be opposed to us in some way. So maybe, next time we hear the news, we can just say, we're going to pray for them. But we don't even ask that question anymore. Because God's heart cares for suffering people, even those who are opposed to him. Now, second thing we kind of see in Obadiah, the first is like care for one's enemies. And the second thing is, on the day that you stood aloof, on the day when strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. And in this passage here, they are criticized for doing nothing in that day, for doing nothing while their brother was being destroyed. And this speaks to the sins of omission, that we just, by ignoring what we ought to do. And I see this and I read this and I think, wow, how many in this world are heading towards destruction while we do nothing? And this convicts me. It says in this Christmas season that we need to be sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Be sharing the fact that Jesus Christ died for people's sins so they could escape a destruction worse than the city of Jerusalem that I've described. This is the time of year, I'm sure you got it this week, this is the time of year when you get like 1,000 requests every day from every organization that relies on giving, like, hey, give money to me right now. And yeah, everyone's like nodding, like this is like Giving Tuesday. It's just so you don't have to feel so bad about spending all the money on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and then, you can give back on Tuesday, so you don't have to feel bad about all the money that you're spending on yourself and gifts. You can give $5 here, and then you're a good person. You can pray about that too. As we think about our giving, we should prioritize gospel ministry, especially in hard places. It's like we have the Global Advance Fund, which I think does a good job in going to hard places, and it's something we should set aside to prioritize. Personally, we should care about the lost. And often, I think this year, when I've talked about evangelism, I was just like, okay, you got to go out there, you got to share the gospel, and that's all good, and that's great. Jamie, Vanessa, they're doing a Bible study on sharing the gospel. Go to it. It's awesome. Now, there are simple things too. If that seems intimidating to you, be like, I'm not knocking on people's doors, being like, hey, believe in Jesus. Maybe that's not for us. Maybe it's good too. But simple things like, hey, invite someone to church, invite someone to the Christmas play, invite someone to a small group, invite someone to Grief Share, like someone had a loss, and that's a great program pointing to the hope of Christ. Because just standing by and giving, doing nothing, we can't do. And think about it in your gifts. Like if you got somebody interested in sports, young man, it's like, get them, Reggie White's book, or, by a sports guy that tells the gospel. Think creatively, because we can't just stand by and do nothing. Because as it says in Obadiah, because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever, because they stood by and did nothing while their brother went to the slaughter. And so it's a warning to us not to stand by loving even our enemies, not rejoicing when something bad happens to people we disagree with, and not standing aloof, but doing what we are called to do to help a world that needs to hear the beautiful gospel of Jesus Christ.